What are the real causes of the Bondi terror attack? Let's find out. I'm Nick Hanna, criminal lawyer, and welcome to The What and the Why. On the 14th of December, 2 gunmen killed 15 people and wounded many more, nearly all of whom were Jewish, at a religious festival at Bondi Beach in Sydney. It was a horrific act of terrorism that shocked the nation to its core. It caused, and continues to cause, immense trauma to the Jewish community, first and foremost, but also the broader Australian community. While mass shooting events do happen in this country from time to time, they're not common, especially with this number of victims. But it's not only the scale of this tragedy that distinguishes it from others, it's also the unprecedented extent to which it's been politicized. Before the spilt blood of the victims had even dried, the blame game was well underway. The pro-Israel lobby and its allies in the mainstream media led the charge, making several key claims about the causes of the attack. In short, these claims are, firstly, that the attack was the inevitable consequence of a rise in anti-Semitism over the past couple of years. Secondly, that this rise in anti-Semitism is the fault of the pro-Palestine movement and/or Islamic extremism. And thirdly, that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese failed to take proper action to counter this rise in anti-Semitism, and therefore he bears ultimate responsibility for the deaths. In the next 2 episodes, I'm going to examine these claims, which I'll refer to collectively as the official narrative for convenience. I'll try to use the skills I have both as a criminal lawyer and investigative journalist to explore what evidence exists to support the official narrative, who is pushing it, and why. In doing so, I'll also consider some alternative claims that compete with the official narrative, including whether Israel or its lobby bears some responsibility for the attack. There's too much to cover in a single episode, so I'll be breaking it up into 2 parts. In part 1, I'll be looking at the question of whether the Bondi attack was actually motivated by anti-Semitism, that is, a desire to kill Jewish people simply because they were Jewish. This is an important preliminary question that needs to be addressed because only if the attack itself was anti-Semitically motivated can it have been caused by the supposed unchecked escalation of anti-Semitism, as the official narrative claims. In part 2, I'll ask, if the attack was anti-Semitic, to what extent was it caused by some growing tide of anti-Semitism, and who ultimately bears responsibility for any rise in anti-Jewish sentiment? Okay, so before I get started, I want to first ask that you like this video and subscribe to my channel if you support the independent journalism that I do entirely for free. I also want to give a few very important caveats before I begin. The first is that, to state the obvious, nothing I say in this video should be seen as any attempt to justify the Bondi terror attack whatsoever. There of course is no justification for this heinous act, and I've been clear about that from the outset. But as the saying goes, to understand is not to condone. And in my view, it's crucial that we as a society try to understand the true causes of this tragedy so we know what we need to do to minimize the risk of something like this ever happening again. To use a medical analogy, without proper diagnosis, there can be no proper treatment. It's also important to bear in mind that the official narrative has already been used to justify the introduction of laws and policies by both federal and state governments which, in my view, represent the most aggressive assault on our civil liberties in living memory, and will fundamentally change the character of this country for good. At the state level, this includes laws effectively banning protests for up to 3 months, the proposed criminalization of certain political slogans, and allowing the Community Security Group, a Jewish security organization with close ties to Israeli military and intelligence, to carry arms. At the federal level, the Albanese government has promised to beef up our hate speech laws and cancel visas for those who spread hate and division, which many fear will be enforced in a discriminatory way to silence people who criticize Israel. Our ability to make informed decisions about these laws and policies depends on our ability to assess the truthfulness of the claims on which they've been justified. This makes the need to scrutinize the official narrative with independent journalism like this ever more acute, particularly given the failure of the mainstream media to do so. Now, the need to examine the official narrative is, in my view, further strengthened by the Albanese government's recent announcement of the establishment of a royal commission in response to the Bondi attack. While one might ordinarily assume that a royal commission would be the best way to identify the causes of the very event in response to which it's been established, I hold some serious concerns with the proposed terms of reference for this royal commission, which is set out in the draft letters patent available on the Attorney General's website. Notably, nowhere in the document is there any mention of the Commissioner, former High Court Justice Virginia Bell, being tasked to examine the actual causes of the attack. Rather, it seems that the focus of the Royal Commission will be the nature and prevalence of anti-Semitism in our institutions and society and the ways to combat it. Crucially, Albanese clarified in a press conference he gave alongside Gillian Siegel, who is the Special Envoy to Combat Anti-Semitism and a senior member of the pro-Israel lobby, that the definition of anti-Semitism to be used at the Royal Commission will be the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IRA, working definition of anti-Semitism. which considers much criticism of Israel to be anti-Jewish. If you want to learn more about the IRA definition and why it's so problematic, you can check out episode 2 of this channel. The second caveat I want to give is that I of course appreciate that this is a highly sensitive topic for many people. 15 members of the Sydney community were murdered in cold blood at an iconic beach that most Australians have probably been to. This attack felt personal for many people in this country, and emotions are still raw. I get that, and I can assure you that my decision to create this video was not made lightly. But in my view, the public interest in having this conversation is just too high. Having said that, I'll of course try to approach the matter with the sensitivity it deserves. This doesn't mean whitewashing the records of certain individuals or organisations, but it does mean ensuring that my criticisms are evidence-based and relevant to the issues at hand. I ask that you wait until you've seen all the information that I'll present in this video before you jump to any conclusions about the motives of the Bondi attackers or even my opinions as to those motives. And I also encourage you to do your own research and listen to a wide variety of sources, including sources you might not agree with, so you can gain different perspectives and make a truly informed decision about this also important matter. The third caveat is that my analysis and commentary in this video is based on the information publicly available as at the time of recording this. I really need to emphasize that there is a lot of crucial information that we still don't know and we might not ever know, and that's part of the problem. Drawing conclusions from incomplete facts is inherently unreliable, and journalists and politicians should be extremely cautious about doing it, particularly about a matter of such immense national importance. Yet that's precisely what they've been doing non-stop since the shooting took place, and it's what I'll try my best to avoid. The final caveat is that, as some of you may know, I'm currently the lawyer representing 3 groups who are bringing the constitutional challenge against the state government's new anti-protest laws. It goes without saying that every opinion I express in this video is that of my own, and not my clients. I don't speak for them in the same way that they don't speak for me. So with the caveats out of the way, let's get started. According to the official narrative, the Bondi terror attack was the inevitable result of an escalation of anti-Semitism in Australia since the 7th of October 2023. Now there's a preliminary issue with this claim, and that is that it's predicated on the assumption that the attack itself was motivated by anti-Semitism. It's an assumption that I think most Australians, including myself, initially made. I mean, after all, this was an attack in which Jewish people were killed at a Jewish religious festival. Seems pretty obvious, right? Well, the more I look into this, the less sure I am. Let me explain. We know that Israel and its lobby have alleged from the outset that the attack was motivated purely by hatred of Jewish people. For example, this is Israeli government spokesperson Shosh Bedrosian speaking the day after the event.
Jews were hunted down, they were murdered for one simple reason: because they were Jewish.
It's a claim that's been repeated endlessly by nearly every politician and journalist in this country. And it's a vital one because it provides the basis for the radical new measures being introduced supposedly to combat anti-Semitism. But what's the actual evidence to support this claim? Before I go on, I should probably explain that when the police are investigating a crime, they'll usually try to identify the possible motives of the perpetrator by looking at what we call direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence is evidence that proves a fact directly without the need for inferences to be drawn. So for example, if I confess to my mate that I robbed the local pub because I needed cash to feed a gambling addiction, that's direct evidence of my motive. But what if I didn't explain to anyone why I did the robbery? Well, then the police would need to rely on circumstantial evidence, which is evidence of a fact from which you can infer another fact. So if the police obtained records from my counsellor showing that I've got a gambling disorder, that would be circumstantial evidence of my motive. Now, the strength of circumstantial evidence will generally depend on the facts of each case. Sticking with the robbery example, if the only evidence of any motive was the counselling record showing my gambling disorder, that evidence is going to be pretty strong. But what if there's also evidence that it was a gay pub that I'd robbed, and I had a long history of making homophobic comments? Well, that means there would be a competing motive and it might be impossible to work out what the real reason was. I should add that, in many cases, there's simply not enough evidence to identify a possible motive with any confidence. Or there might be multiple possible motives and it's too difficult for the police to figure out which is the sole or even the dominant one. So with all that said, let's get back to the Bondi attack. What do we know about the motive of the perpetrators? Well, when it comes to direct evidence, there's not a lot to go off. As far as we're aware, there's no witness who suggests they heard either assailant say anything as they committed the attack. And it's been reported that Naveed Akram has declined to be interviewed by police, which is to be expected, while his father, Sajid Akram, was of course killed during the incident, so questioning him wasn't an option. However, there is one very important piece of apparent direct evidence that is yet to be released to the public, and that is a video that the police are said to have located on Naveed's phone. As I've explained previously on this channel, when the police charge someone with a criminal offence, they're required to provide a document called a fact sheet, which summarises the allegations against the accused person. In Naveed's court case, the prosecution applied for and were granted a non-publication order preventing the publication of the content of the fact sheet. However, this was subsequently overturned and the media were able to report on the document. In the document, the police alleged that the cops found a video on Naveed's phone in which he and his father recite their political and religious views and appear to summarize their justification for the Bondi terrorist attack. It states that the two men are supposedly depicted in the video to be sitting in front of an image of an Islamic State flag with long-arm firearms. Naveed is said to appear to be reciting a passage from the Quran, and that crucially, following the recitation, both he and his father make a number of statements regarding their motivation for the Bondi attack and condemning the acts of, quote, Zionists. Now, I'd like to think that everyone watching my channel knows what a Zionist is, but for any newcomers, a Zionist is someone who supports the ideology of Zionism, which is essentially the belief that Jews have a right to maintain a Jewish supremacist state on the land that was historically known as Palestine. So what are we to make of this video recorded by the terrorists? Well, it raises some important questions that I don't believe have been asked by the media. The first question is whether the men actually explain in the video which acts of Zionists they condemn. Not that there's any shortage to choose from. Is it the genocide that Israel's been carrying out against the predominantly Muslim population of Gaza for the past 2+ years? A genocide in which tens of thousands of children have been slaughtered and more than 1,000 mosques destroyed in whole or in part by Israeli bombardment? Or is it the thousands of Muslims that Israel's killed in the 5 other countries it's attacked in the past 18 months alone? That's Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Yemen, and Qatar. A second question is, do the men say anything disparaging about Jews or Judaism in the video, or express any intention to kill Jewish people based on their religion? I think we can safely assume that, if they had, the police would have disclosed this and would have made front-page news. Lastly, there's a question about whether the video is actually a confession as to the men's motive for the Bondi attack specifically. Based on my experience as a criminal lawyer, when I read something like the men appear to summarize their justification in the video, that suggests they didn't expressly do that, but rather it's just an inference that's been drawn by the cops. Now, it might be a strong inference, but it might not be. It's impossible to be sure without knowing what the men actually said. Now, all of this could be cleared up very easily if the video was released. But it seems that it's being intentionally withheld. Why is that? Well, the government hasn't offered any official explanation for its decision not to release the alleged video confession of the Bondi shooters. But it's not a surprising move. In fact, it's common for governments to try to suppress the dissemination of statements given by terrorists as to their motives. Why? Well, the governments often argue that the censorship is justified on security grounds. For example, after the Christchurch shooting in 2019, New Zealand's chief censor banned the manifesto prepared by the shooter on the basis that it was deliberately constructed to inspire and further murder and terrorism. But critics argue that in some cases at least, the real reason governments do this is to control the narrative. Perhaps the most notable example of this is with Osama bin Laden's letter to the American people, which was published by Al-Qaeda about a year after the horrific September 11 attacks. In the letter, bin Laden sets out his grievances with the US, some of which are based on religious grounds. However, most of the grievances are political in nature. Most relevantly, bin Laden states the following: "Why are we fighting and opposing you? The answer is very simple, because you attacked us and continue to attack us." Bin Laden then lists various acts of US military aggression against predominantly Muslim countries. At the top of the list is Palestine. Specifically, and to use bin Laden's words, the American support for the occupation of Palestine by the Jews and the oppression, killing, expulsion and destruction which that occupation has resulted in. The letter contradicted the US government and corporate media's narrative as to the motive of the September 11 perpetrators, as was expressed quintessentially by then US President George W. Bush in the weeks following the attack.
Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They hate what they see right here in this chamber. A democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other.
The letter forced readers to confront the idea that the violence at the heart of US foreign policy, in particular its unconditional support for Israeli crimes in Palestine, has created what's called blowback. That is, revenge or counterattacks against Americans. Unsurprisingly, the letter was intentionally ignored by most of the mainstream media, but it went viral on social media during Israel's recent genocide in Gaza, with videos about it receiving more than 15 million views on TikTok alone. In response, TikTok and other platforms deleted such videos, and The Guardian, which had been one of the only media outlets to have published the letter, removed it from their website. The censorship of the letter by TikTok and The Guardian drew criticisms from free speech advocates, and it's not difficult to see why. Regardless of what you think of bin Laden or his letter, and to be clear, I'm not a fan of either, it's plainly an important historical document that can promote informed discourse in our society. This is particularly important at a time when there's an increasingly prominent debate within the US and the West in general about the military, financial and political support that our countries provide to Israel and the price we have to pay for it. And it's for this same reason that I think the video confession of the Bondi shooters shouldn't be withheld from the Australian public. At a time when we're being asked to accept sweeping new laws on the basis of the purported motives of these two men, isn't it vital that we hear from the men themselves rather than just cherry-picked words, summaries, or interpretations made by individuals and organizations that may have their own agendas? This is all the more crucial when public trust in the government and the mainstream media appears to be at an all-time low, especially when it comes to anything Israel-related. Releasing the video will also avoid what's called the forbidden knowledge effect, which is when information seems more exciting and cool because it's been censored, and so more people search for it, and more importantly, place more weight on it. Okay, so now that we've discussed the direct evidence of the shooter's motives, I want to move on to the circumstantial evidence. As we know, most of the victims of the attack were Jewish people attending an event marking a Jewish holiday, namely Chanukah by the Sea, a celebration to commemorate the first night of Judaism's 8-day Festival of Lights. The attack was clearly targeted in that the terrorists chose to shoot up this festival on this particular day. This fact alone gives rise to a strong inference that the attack was anti-Semitically motivated. But is it the only fact that we should consider when deciding what conclusions to draw? Let's start by looking at who was behind the festival. The main organizer of Chanukah by the Sea was Chabad of Bondi, which is a community center that's part of the global ultra-Orthodox Jewish movement Chabad Lubavitch, commonly referred to simply as Chabad. Chabad was founded back in 1775, but it only came to prominence in the second half of the 20th century, under the leadership of the Russian-American rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who is often referred to by his followers as the Rebbe. Schneerson was not only a spiritual leader, but he was also very outspoken on political issues, particularly when it came to Israel. He was an extreme Zionist who supported the aggressive expansion of Jewish-only settlements on stolen Palestinian land in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. This is Schneerson speaking with Menachem, the then mayor of the illegal Israeli settlement of Ariel, and urging him against returning land to the Palestinians as part of any peace deal. The recording is from 1989, and Schneerson's reference to Intifada is a reference to the largely non-violent Palestinian uprising that had started in late 1987 in response to Israel's brutal military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The word Intifada, which means shaking off in Arabic, has been in the news a lot lately given the New South Wales government's unprecedented proposal to ban the phrase globalize the Intifada. So I thought this video of Schneerson implicitly acknowledging the link between Israel's occupation and the Intifada was particularly timely. This notion of Israel achieving peace through military domination of the Palestinians rather than through negotiations was central to Schneerson's political philosophy. Here he is speaking with Shlomo Gazet, the former head of Israel's Military Intelligence Directorate. Schneerson also advocated for a greater Israel, occupying land which extended well beyond the borders of historic Palestine. This is him in 1981 criticizing the far-right Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin for agreeing to the Camp David Accords with Egypt, which saw Israel return the Sinai Peninsula, which it had seized from Egypt in 1967, in exchange for peace.
darf soll sein stark in der Starkheit, mit welcher sie verstehen und rechnen mit sie. Beschaß mal Tag gegeben, die Nacht, hat ihn bewiesen die größte Schwachkeit.
Similarly, Schneerson advocated for Israel's ongoing occupation of southern Lebanon, which lasted until it was liberated by Lebanese resistance groups led by Hezbollah in 2000. This is him speaking in 1983 after Israel had killed an estimated 10,000 Lebanese and Palestinian civilians in its war in Lebanon.
Wenn es aus der Honke der Linie von Lebanon ist gewähnt als zugegerichtete Tochnis, wo wegen der Tochnis haben gewusst Israel. Beschaß mit das nie durchführen. Wird sich sehen, dass viele Jiden haben mehr, aber die Belschäden.
Schneerson died in 1994, but he's still revered by the Chabad movement, including Chabad of Bondi. Rabbi Eli Schlanger, who was killed during the Bondi attack, was the assistant rabbi at the Chabad of Bondi. This is a video he recorded back in April last year at the new Chabad house at Bondi.
We're proud to hang this photo today, and even prouder to carry the Rebbe's mission forward, right here in our community. May this new Chabad house be a source of learning, connection to Hashem, and much joy. One Jew at a time, one step closer to Mashiach.
The Chabad movement's staunch support for Israeli militarism has continued since the death of Schneerson. In 2009, Israel conducted a deadly military campaign in Gaza which it called Operation Cast Lead, which resulted in the deaths of more than 1,100 Palestinians, most of whom were civilians. On the Israeli side, 13 people were killed, nearly all of them soldiers. During this war, Chabad published an article in which it was argued that during times like this, each one of us becomes an ambassador for Israel. Even if you don't agree with everything Israel does, any decent person must stand up for Israel's right to self-defense. The article then set out some answers to frequently asked questions, including, how can Israel justify killing civilians if their intent is to crush Hamas? The response argued, a civilian who is killed while being used by a terrorist as a human shield is a victim of the terrorist, not the Israeli army, who does not target innocent civilians. It should be noted that Amnesty International investigated the claim that Hamas used civilian shields during the 2009 war and found no evidence to support it. Interestingly, this article was written by Aaron Moss, a Sydney-based Chabad rabbi who conducted the funeral for Rabbi Schlanger. In 2014, Israel launched a bloody offensive in Gaza which it called Operation Protective Edge, in which more than 2,300 Palestinians were killed, the vast majority of them civilians. In support, Chabad tweeted a worldwide call for prayers on behalf of IDF soldiers as they started their ground invasion of Gaza. During the same war, Chabad ran a campaign encouraging followers to write letters to IDF soldiers, which Chabad then delivered. In this tweet it states that IDF troops were moved by the thousands of letters they received via Chabad. In 2018, the Palestinians staged a series of largely peaceful protests on the Gaza-Israel border known as the Great March of Return, where they demanded that Israel recognize their right to return home to the villages, towns and cities from which they and their parents were expelled in 1948, as well as an end to Israel's brutal blockade of Gaza's land, air and sea. The Israeli military responded by shooting unarmed protesters en masse. More than 223 Palestinians were killed by live ammunition, including 46 children, with more than 8,000 injured by Israeli snipers. In an interview with the Israeli newspaper Haaretz shortly afterwards, Israeli snipers admitted to having competed with each other as to how many Palestinians they could kneecap. In December 2018, while the Great March of Return was still well underway, Chabad posted a video of some Chabad students with IDF soldiers which it stated were on the front lines celebrating Chanukah. Chabad's support for the Israeli army has increased significantly during the current war in Gaza, which, it must be remembered, has been found to constitute the crime of genocide by every major human rights organization and genocide expert. On the 12th of October 2023, Chabad posted an article on its website titled, "Chabad centers near IDF bases provide lifelines for soldiers headed to war." The article showed a photograph of volunteers from the Chabad branch in occupied Eilat, with a large contingent of Israeli soldiers. In the article, it stated that all around Israel, Chabad Lubavitch emissaries and a host of volunteers are working around the clock to source and deliver supplies to those on active duty. It went on to say that the Chabad emissaries provide both material and spiritual sustenance to the troops every day. 2 weeks later, Chabad was boasting on X that its Miami delegation had brought supplies and positive spirits to Israel, including gear for IDF soldiers. In December 2023, Chabad tweeted a photo of its members with a group of Israeli soldiers again celebrating Chanukah. And in June 2024, while the Israeli military was flattening the southern Gazan town of Rafah, Chabad posted a video of an IDF Chabad chaplain celebrating the printing of Tanya, which are philosophical writings of the founder of the Chabad movement inside occupied Rafah.
Had a Tanya on a truck that was in a mission inside of Rafiah. This truck was moving along with a unit that was doing a mission in Rafiah, and all along it was printing a Tanya.
So not only has the Chabad movement provided spiritual and political support for Israel's genocidal war in Gaza, but it's also boasted about its provision of direct material support. In recent years, the US-based leadership of the Chabad has also aligned itself with some of the most openly racist and genocidal figures in Israeli politics, including Minister for National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir, as well as Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. These ministers are considered so extreme that last year they were sanctioned by the staunchly pro-Israel governments of the UK and Canada, as well as Australia. Now, I should make clear that I'm not alleging that any Australian Chabad chapter has provided material support to Israeli soldiers or that its leadership has ties with Ben-Gvir or Smotrich. I don't know either way, and it's not possible to know because most of the senior Chabad figures have traditionally kept a low public profile. But there are some exceptions, perhaps the most notable of which was Rabbi Eli Schlanger. Rabbi Schlanger, who is perhaps the most prominent of the Bondi terror attack victims, was the assistant rabbi at Chabad of Bondi and the organizer of the Chanukah By The Sea festival that was targeted. If you get your news from the mainstream media, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Schlanger was one of the most decent human beings to ever have walked this land.
Rabbi Eli Schlanger was mourned by hundreds at a service in Bondi, where he was remembered as one of the purest and most sincere people.
Remembered as one of the purest and most sincere people.
Anyone who knew him knew that he was the very best of us. This is a person who rose each day with a simple mission of doing good.
New South Wales Premier Chris Minns had similar words to say.
This morning I was able to attend Rabbi Eli's funeral, which was a celebration of a man that was a gift for our city and someone who did so much, not just for the Jewish community, but for everybody that lives in New South Wales.
While I've got no doubt that Schlanger had many admirable qualities and served the Jewish community well, there is a side to him that's been conspicuously absent from the mainstream media's coverage of him, and that is his vocal support for the Israeli war machine during the genocide in Gaza. In late October 2023, when Israel's genocide in Gaza was well underway, Schlanger was one of 27 Chabad rabbis from the US, Canada and Australia to travel on a rabbinic solidarity mission to Israel. The stated objective of the trip was to inspire, unify and pray for and with IDF soldiers, along with families of the murdered, the captive and wounded. While there, Schlanger posted numerous photos and videos of himself with uniformed Israeli troops on his public Instagram account. In a post captioned "Visit to the army base on the front line," he shared photos of himself eating with, embracing and kissing the head of armed soldiers, and even a photo posing with soldiers while he held a machine gun himself. This is a video of Schlanger at the same base with a caption that reads, "Receiving a blessing from one of the holiest people on earth." This is consistent with the teaching of Schneerson that IDF soldiers are to be cherished as emissaries of the Jewish people. In another video, Schlanger can be seen handing cash to the Chabad rabbi of occupied Ashkelon, next to 2 Israeli soldiers.
Okay, I'd like to thank very, very much the people of Bondi, Australia, for their very, very considerate and important donation that will help us protect the people of Ashkelon.
Upon his return from this trip, Chabad of Bondi organized an event titled Debrief. Rabbi Eli Schlanger returns from a Blitz Israel mission. The photo used to advertise the event was of Schlanger speaking with an Israeli soldier. At around the same time, Schlanger posted a photo of Schneerson with what I think on any view can be considered a pro-war caption that included the following text: "The Rebbe instructed the Israeli government to stand strong against our enemies and friends, not to negotiate with or give up on any part of Israel to our enemies." The Rebbe instructed Jews around the world to stand with their chins up and encouraged us to believe and know that the war will be victorious. As the genocide in Gaza progressed, Schlanger continued to use social media to post in support of Israel's war effort. In January 2024, American commentator Jackson Hinkle tweeted a video of the South African legal team returning to Johannesburg after running their largely successful application for interim measures against Israel. Schlanger replied with a one-word tweet, Amalek. Amalek is a reference to the nation of people who, according to the Hebrew Bible, God instructed the Israelites to annihilate entirely, including the women, children, babies, and animals. Ironically, the South African legal team had relied upon Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's use of the same word when justifying his war in Gaza as evidence of genocidal intent. If you go to the replies section on Schlanger's Twitter account, you can see that he used the word Amalek on various occasions when responding to pro-Palestinian tweets. On the 26th of May 2024, while Israel's deadly offensive in Rafah was in full effect, Schlanger posted this photo of Schneerson with the caption, "The Rebbe! This photo demonstrates the Rebbe's love for the IDF. Wounded soldiers often traveled to the Rebbe for his blessings." In July 2024, Schlanger posted a photograph of himself with an Israeli soldier, accompanied by a long caption in which he argued that Jews have the right to rule Palestine, which he of course calls Israel, because of, quote, divine promise stated in the Torah that God gave the land to us. In July 2025, former UK politician George Galloway retweeted a video of an interview with a clearly emaciated woman in Gaza who complains of not having eaten in 5 days. Galloway's caption reads, "Any reaction? Anywhere? Anyone?" To which Schlanger responded, "AI." This is in the context of Human Rights Watch accusing Israel of using starvation as a weapon of war from as early as December 2023, and Amnesty International publishing a statement just 2 weeks prior to Galloway's tweet in which it claimed that Israel was continuing to use starvation as a weapon of war in Gaza. 2 months later, in September 2025, journalist Alan McLeod tweeted, "More empathy has been shown for Charlie Kirk over the past 12 hours than for tens of thousands of innocent Palestinian children in 2 years." Schlanger replied by saying, "Surely that shows where the majority of the world stands." Okay, so now that we've discussed the organization behind the event, I want to talk briefly about the event itself. The fact that the Bondi shooting took place at an event marking the Jewish religious holiday of Chanukah has been one of the main facts on which the political and media class have based their assertion that the attack was religiously and not politically motivated. While the event was clearly religious, being a festival to celebrate the first day of Chanukah, is there more to the story? Specifically, was this both a religious and a political event? Each year, the Chabad of Bondi's Chanukah event includes various speakers. I haven't been able to find a list of all the people who've spoken there over the years, but I was able to identify some of the speakers. At the top of the list is none other than Alex Ryvchin, the co-CEO of Australia's largest pro-Israel lobby group, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, or the ECAJ. As I discussed on the last episode on this channel, Ryvchin, who has described Schlanger as his close friend and rabbi, has a long history of supporting Israeli militarism, including during the current genocide in Gaza, publicly praising the Israeli military on social media with comments such as, "Glory to the heroes of the IDF," "Bless the heroes of the IDF," and "Thank you to the heroic female soldiers of the IDF. We love you and we're with you." When Israel launched its unilateral and unlawful military strikes on Iran in June last year, Ryvchin defended not only the attacks, but also the killing of Iranian scientists.
The top 3 generals in the Iranian army have been knocked off. 2 of their leading nuclear scientists, the majority of their nuclear facilities have been hit. And I think this would be a real game changer in the region. I think something that was badly needed and certainly acts in the interest of peace in the long term.
In an interview with Channel 7 News on the day following the Bondi attack, Ryvchin disclosed this about his connection to the festival.
It's not only a communal tragedy, a national tragedy, but it's deeply personal. I mean, this is my community. This event is one that I've spoken at for the last 10 years. I was scheduled to speak at it again this year and to come with my 3 daughters and my wife, as I do every year.
On Ryvchin's public Instagram account, you can find a recording of him speaking at the Chabad of Bondi's Chanukah event held in December 2024. I found this part of it highly revealing.
In the new year, we will see a federal election which will be the most consequential election in the history of the Australian Jewish community. But we know that no matter what happens, we will prevail and we will endure, because that is what we do and that is who we are. I urge you to look to your community for strength. Look to our brothers and sisters in Israel, who have taken down our enemies one by one, pager by pager.
The reference to pages is of course a reference to the pager attacks in Lebanon in September 2024, when Israel simultaneously detonated thousands of explosive devices it had concealed inside pages, killing and maiming thousands of Lebanese citizens, both Hezbollah fighters and civilians, including numerous children. So there you have it. Clear evidence that at least a recent Chabad Chanukah festival at Bondi, there was not only political speech, but political speech praising a military operation that, it should be noted, was widely condemned by human rights experts as violating international law. Even the former director of the CIA, Leon Panetta, described it as a form of terrorism.
Is it terrorism?
I don't think there's any question that it's a form of terrorism.
The only other recording I found of Ryvchin speaking at a Chabad of Bondi Chanukah event was from December 2022. In it, Ryvchin complains of the Albanese government's decision to reverse the highly contentious decision of the previous Scott Morrison government to move the Australian embassy from Tel Aviv to occupied Jerusalem. Ryvchin then ends his speech with these words.
So friends, enjoy this festival of lights and miracles. Cherish being a Jew, cherish being an Australian, and cherish living in a time when Zion and Jerusalem is in our hands.
I haven't seen any recordings of Ryvchin's speeches at the other Chanukah festivals, but I think it's safe to assume that they would have also been politics heavy and expressing strong support for Israel. I mean, after all, Ryvchin is not a spiritual leader, but rather is a political leader and senior Israel lobbyist. Now, Ryvchin is just one of several Zionist politicians who have spoken at Chabad of Bondi Chanukah events over the years. Others include former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, current Senator and former member for Wentworth and former Ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma, and former New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian. Rabbi Schlanger also appears to have spoken each year at the festival, which is unsurprising given his organising role and senior position within Chabad. I should make clear that I haven't seen recordings of any of these other politicians' speeches, so I can't speak to the content of what they said. In addition to the live speakers, videos of the late Rabbi Schneerson, whose hardline pro-Israel political views I discussed earlier, appear to have been played at each year's festivals. Furthermore, at some of the previous year's festivals, the main minaret had been adorned with a large portrait of Schneerson. Okay, so now that we've spoken about the Chabad of Bondi and its Chanukah festival, I want to turn my attention back to the other side of the equation, and that is the connection between the two shooters and the organization known as the Islamic State. For convenience and out of habit, I'm going to refer to the Islamic State as ISIS, which is the acronym for its former name, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. 2 days after the Bondi attack, Prime Minister Albanese claimed that the perpetrators appeared to have been driven by Islamic State ideology. On the 30th of December, the Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police, Chrissy Barrett, gave a press conference in which she provided an update about the investigation. She said that, despite the initial speculation in the media that the two men underwent training for the attack when they travelled to the Philippines in November, the AFP's current view is that, having reviewed the CCTV footage from the Philippines, this does not appear to be the case. The Commissioner went on to state that the AFP's current assessment is as follows.
These individuals are alleged to have acted alone. There is no evidence to suggest these alleged offenders were part of a broader terrorist cell or were directed by others to carry out an attack.
However, she reiterated that she believes the attack was inspired by ISIS. And I don't think there can be any doubt about that. I mean, we know that an ISIS flag was displayed on the car that they'd parked at the scene of the crime. Plainly, this demonstrates a clear intention on their part to associate the terror attack with the organisation. In addition, it's been reported that another ISIS flag was reportedly located by police in the same vehicle, and that, as I mentioned earlier, the police say that they located a video on Naveed's phone depicting him and his father standing in front of an ISIS flag while they appeared to provide an explanation for the attack. So I don't think there's any question the attack was at least inspired by the ideology of ISIS. The question is, what does this tell us about whether or not the attack was motivated by anti-Semitism? Well, to answer that question, we first need to ask, what is ISIS and what does it believe? It's beyond the scope of this episode to embark upon a detailed analysis of ISIS and its ideology, and I'll be doing this in a later episode, so I'm going to keep it very brief for now. In short, ISIS is an international militant organization that originated in Iraq in the wake of the 2003 US invasion and subsequent occupation, but then spread to Syria and beyond. ISIS subscribes to an extreme Sunni Islamist ideology that is commonly referred to as Salafi-Jihadism, which seeks to establish a global caliphate through violent means. Salafi-Jihadism is the same ideology at the core of Al-Qaeda, from which ISIS originally emanated. ISIS has been responsible for countless terrorist attacks targeting civilians. Contrary to the impression conveyed by most of the mainstream media, the vast majority of these attacks have been in Muslim-predominant countries against fellow Muslims, who ISIS perceives as not being true believers of Islam and/or posing a threat to their plans for dominance. But there have also been numerous attacks in the West carried out by people who are either members of or inspired by ISIS, some of which targeted Jewish people. If you look at the speeches of the leaders of ISIS and other Salafi jihadi groups like Al-Qaeda, as well as the statements published by these groups, you'll often see remarks that I think could fairly be characterized as anti-Semitic. I mean, at its root, this is an ideology which I would describe as being Muslim supremacist. As a result, it views and seeks to treat all non-Muslims, including Jews, as well as millions of Muslims who it doesn't consider to be pure enough, as inferior. But it's important to understand that the focus of the discussion of Jews in Salafi jihadi discourse is generally on what they describe as the Jewish occupation of Palestine, which they see as Muslim land, and the crimes of Jews against the Muslims of Palestine and the neighboring countries. In this way, there is a conflation between the Jewish people and Zionists, between Israel and Judaism. A well-known example of this is in Osama bin Laden's letter to America, which I discussed earlier. Now, while it's technically correct that the people occupying Palestine and carrying out a genocide in Gaza are Jewish and claim to be doing so on behalf of the Jewish people, most Palestinian groups avoid using such terminology so as to avoid any suggestion that they are blaming all Jews for the actions of Israel and to emphasize that their issue is with Zionism and not Judaism. And while I of course think that it's immoral and illogical to hold resentment towards all Jewish people because of the actions of Israel, it's not surprising that some people feel this way, particularly if the only thing they really know about Jewish people are the horrific crimes committed in their name. So what's the upshot of all this? Well, I think that depends on the extent to which these two men were aware of and adhered to the official tenets of ISIS. And on that front, no evidence has been made public yet. For example, we don't know if either of the men had studied any ISIS or Salafi jihadi literature regarding Jews or Israel. We don't know if they held a hatred for Jews in general, and if so, for what reasons. Specifically, to what extent was any anti-Semitism on their part a product of their perception that Jews are responsible for the crimes of Israel, and to what extent did this motivate them to carry out the Bondi attack? In my view, these are all important questions that will need to be explored if we are serious about understanding the real causes of the Bondi shooting. While I think that it's safe to assume that it's likely that both men harbored both anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist views and that this contributed to their offending in no small part, assuming isn't good enough. We need certainty. Now, the content of Naveed's mobile phone may shed a lot of light on these questions. As I discuss in detail on the first episode of this channel, Australian police use a product called the Universal Forensic Extraction Device manufactured by an Israeli surveillance company called Cellebrite to extract all of the data from mobile phones that they seize from suspects. So, depending on the lengths that Naveed went to try to cover his tracks, the Cellebrite download of his phone will likely reveal his internet search history, the videos he watched, places he went to, and communications he had with others. As discussed earlier, the police have already disclosed that Naveed's phone contains a video which appears to set out his reasons for the attack, and that the only reason that has been revealed so far is the acts of Zionists. But a lot more information is needed in order to draw reliable conclusions as to the motivation of the Bondi shooting, and that is why it's imperative in my view that the relevant content of the phone be made public. Without it, we simply don't have the ability to properly test and scrutinize the official narrative. There's one last thing I'll say on this topic before I move on. This is not the first time that someone who subscribes to a Salafi jihadi ideology has attacked a Chabad target. In 2008, militants belonging to the Pakistani-based organization Lashkar-e-Taiba, or LET, carried out a series of terror attacks in Mumbai, India, which led to 175 deaths and hundreds of injuries. One of the targets of the attack was the Nariman House, which was a Chabad center based in South Mumbai.
Rabbi Gabriel Holzberg, his wife Ryvchin, killed inside this building in South Mumbai's Nariman House in the attacks of November 2008.
Not a lot appears to have been written about the motive for the attack. But in one book I saw, the author stated that the motive for the attack was the desire by the LET to wage a wider war against the West and to advance the interests of Pakistani intelligence, which was alleged to have aided the attacks. But I simply don't know enough to be able to offer any meaningful opinion about the Mumbai attack and what, if anything, it can tell us about the Bondi attack. Okay, so I've just spent a lot of time discussing what I believe are the most relevant pieces of evidence, both direct and circumstantial, that shed light on the possible motives of the Bondi shooters. I now want to end this video by synthesizing the evidence as a whole and setting out some conclusions that I think we can draw. I'm going to deal first with the only supposedly direct evidence we have, which, as you recall, is the video located on the mobile phone of Naveed, in which the two men allegedly provide an explanation for the Bondi attack in which they condemn the acts of Zionists. As I explained earlier in this video, my view is that this evidence fails to establish the motive on its own because it's incomplete, vague, and equivocal. However, to the extent that we can draw any conclusions from this video, it points towards the attack being motivated in response to the conduct of the State of Israel and/or its supporters rather than hatred of Jewish people. Now, this direct evidence must be considered in the context of the circumstantial evidence that I've discussed in this video. Well, what conclusions can we draw from that? In my view, they are the following. 1. This attack was clearly targeted at persons attending the Chanukah By The Sea festival at Bondi. Given that this is a festival organized for Jewish people to mark a Jewish religious holiday, I think we can safely assume that the shooters were targeting people they believed would be Jewish. Viewed in isolation, this fact gives rise to a strong inference that the attack was anti-Semitically motivated. That is, that it was motivated by a desire to kill Jewish people on account of their being Jewish. 2. The organization behind the festival, Chabad of Bondi, is part of the global Chabad movement, which follows the late Rabbi Schneerson, who in my view can accurately be characterized as an extreme Jewish supremacist. Schneerson advocated not only in support of Israel's military occupation of all Palestinian land, but also the land of neighboring countries, which formed part of what he saw as Greater Israel. The global Chabad movement has a long history of public advocacy in support of Israel's wars, and moreover, has provided significant material support to Israeli soldiers during the current genocide in Gaza. Rabbi Eli Schlanger, the late assistant rabbi of Chabad of Bondi, and the person who organized the festival, was an outspoken supporter of Israel's war in Gaza, who used his public social media accounts to post photographs of himself with Israeli soldiers on the front line with Gaza, as well as other pro-Israel content that I think could fairly be described as inflammatory to say the least. If the shooters were aware of Chabad and Rabbi Schlanger's history of supporting Israeli militarism, this would provide an alternative possible explanation for the shooting. That is, that they targeted it due to the identity of the organizers and what they represent, rather than simply the religion of the expected attendees. It would also sit well with the supposed direct evidence we have, being the shooters' condemnation of acts of Zionists on the video explaining their reasons for the attack. The obvious difficulty with this, though, is that we don't even know if the shooters were aware of Chabad or Rabbi Schlanger's history. If they weren't aware, it's largely irrelevant. In my view, this is an important matter that needs to be investigated by the police and at the upcoming royal commissions. 3. While the Chanukah By The Sea event was clearly a religious festival, it also had political elements. At previous year's festivals, prominent Zionist political leaders had spoken, including the senior pro-Israel advocate Alex Ryvchin, who at the 2024 event celebrated Israel's Pager terrorist attack in Lebanon. In addition, video clips of Schneerson are played at the festival each year, and large portraits of the hardline Zionist rabbi have been fixed to minarets at some of the previous festivals. Because we don't know the content of the other leaders' political speeches or the Schneerson clips that were played, it's impossible to determine the extent to which the event could be properly characterized as political. Despite this, the political elements of this festival supports the proposition that it may have been targeted due to its support for Israel rather than the religion of its attendees. But again, this can only be true if the assailants were aware of this history of the festival, which they may well have not been. Again, this is something that will need to be explored by the investigators and at the upcoming royal commissions. And lastly, 4. The fact that the terrorists were inspired by ISIS and therefore likely held Salafi-Jihadi beliefs somewhat complicates the task of discerning their motive. Salafi-Jihadi ideology definitely contains anti-Semitic elements and often conflates Jews with Zionists. Having said that, it usually does so in the context of what it describes as Jewish crimes against Muslims, which is a reference to Israel's occupation of Palestine, which it views as Muslim land. It's difficult to draw definitive conclusions about this because we don't know the extent to which each assailant subscribed to particular tenets of Salafi-Jihadi ideology, particularly as it concerns Jewish people. I think we can safely assume that, at the very least, they would have been incensed by the live-streamed genocide that Israel has been carrying out against the predominantly Muslim population of Gaza over the past 2.25 years, as hundreds of millions of Muslims and non-Muslims around the world have been. This is also consistent with their condemnation of Zionist acts in their alleged video confession. However, the fact that these men supported ISIS means that, unlike most people, they likely failed to draw a distinction between Israel and Jews. That is, they were more likely to hold Jewish people as a whole responsible for the actions of Israel rather than just Zionists. My ultimate conclusion is that the evidence that's been made public so far is insufficient to reveal the true motive of the shooters. It's possible that they were motivated by anti-Semitism, it's possible that they were motivated by revenge against Israel and/or its supporters, and it's possible that it was a bit of both. It's also possible that there's some entirely separate motivation which I haven't contemplated. Regardless of the motive, I want to make my position very clear. Nothing justified the horrific attack that took place at Bondi, and nothing ever will. My intention in investigating the possible motives of the attackers is of course not to seek to excuse their conduct, but rather to understand it so that we can identify the real causes of this heinous crime. Only once we are armed with all of the relevant facts will we be able to assess the government's claims that the attack was the inevitable consequence of a rise in anti-Semitism and that laws which seriously undermine our democratic rights are necessary in order to combat that rise and protect the community. And only then will we be able to recognize what needs to be done in order to minimize the risk of another terrible tragedy like this happening again in this country. But I want to reiterate that, whether the victims were targeted because they were Jewish or because the shooters held them somehow responsible for the actions of Israel or the organizers of the event, this was a crime that should be clearly and unequivocally condemned. And while some of the victims of the Bondi shooting were outspoken supporters of Israel, most do not appear to have been. But even if each and every one of them had have been senior members of the pro-Israel lobby, I would be strongly against any violence being perpetrated against them. Anyone who has been following my channel knows that I'm a staunch proponent of freedom of speech. I don't believe that anyone should be harmed for expressing their views, even if their views I disagree with vehemently. As I said in the last episode, I don't even think that Zionist doctors who advocated for Israel during this genocide should face professional harm in the form of complaints to the regulatory bodies, so I definitely don't think that they should face physical harm. Okay, so that's all for today. In the next episode, I'll ask whether, to the extent that this attack was motivated by anti-Semitism, was it the result of a supposed escalation in anti-Semitism, and if so, what were the real causes of that escalation? If you made it this far, that hopefully means you value my journalism, so please give the video a like and comment and subscribe to my channel. Until next time.